tanker sits outside the Strait of Hormuz with 2 million barrels of oil in its hull. It is not waiting because an American destroyer is blocking the route. It is not waiting because Iran has a warship sitting directly in front of it. It is waiting because the most important oil corridor on Earth is no longer just a passage of water. It is becoming a negotiation. And the country now sitting inside that negotiation is not the United States Navy. It is Qatar. A Qatari negotiating team has reportedly arrived in Tehran in coordination with the United States to help secure a deal aimed at ending the war and resolving the remaining disputes around the Strait of Hormuz. Regional diplomacy is now moving through Pakistan, Qatar, Oman, Washington, Tehran, and the Gulf states at the same time. But here is the problem. Iran does not just want Hormuz reopened. Iran wants the rules of Hormuz rewritten. For decades, the basic idea was simple. A tanker loaded oil in the Gulf. It moved through the Strait of Hormuz. It entered the Gulf of Oman. Then it sailed toward Asia, Europe, or the rest of the world. That movement was never politically neutral, but operationally the rule was clear. The Strait of Hormuz was a choke point, not a checkpoint. Now that distinction is collapsing. Because Iran is not only trying to decide whether ships can pass, it is trying to decide how they pass, which route they take, which information they provide, which state protects them, which authority clears them, and in some cases whether passage comes with a fee. Reuters reported this week that Iran is consolidating control over Hormuz through island checkpoints, diplomatic arrangements, vessel vetting, and sometimes payments for safe passage. The same reporting described a multi-tiered system where politically connected vessels may receive more favorable treatment while others face more risk, delay, or scrutiny. Stop and think about what that means. A waterway can be open on a map and still not be free in practice. If a ship needs permission, a route, a security contact, a diplomatic sponsor, or a payment before it can move, then the strait has not simply reopened. It has been converted into a managed passage system. And that is why Qatar suddenly matters. Qatar is not the biggest country in the Gulf. It does not have the largest navy. It does not control the strait militarily. But Qatar has something more useful in this exact moment. Access. Access to Washington. Access to Tehran. Access to Gulf monarchies that are terrified of what Iran is trying to normalize. And access to the energy system that makes Hormuz matter in the first place. Qatar is one of the world's major liquefied natural gas exporters, and around 1/5 of global LNG trade moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024, much of it from Qatar. The same choke point also carried about 20 million barrels per day of oil and petroleum liquids in 2024, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. So when Qatar enters the negotiation, it is not entering as a neutral charity worker. It is entering as a state whose own economic bloodstream runs through the same narrow waterway. If Hormuz becomes a permanent Iranian checkpoint, Qatar feels it. If insurance costs stay elevated, Qatar feels it. If China, Europe, or Asia begin doubting the reliability of Gulf energy routes, Qatar feels it. And if a deal is written badly, Qatar may be living next to that mistake for decades. That is the real tension underneath the diplomacy. Washington wants the strait open. Iran wants the strait managed. Qatar is standing between those two definitions. And those definitions are not a small technical detail. They are the whole fight. From Washington's perspective, Hormuz cannot become a toll lane, a permit lane, or a corridor controlled by the country that just threatened it. From Tehran's perspective, the language is softer. Iran talks about security mechanisms, safe traffic, coastal state coordination, and guarantees against future attacks. And Oman matters because the practical route through the strait depends on both sides of the waterway, not only on Iran and the United States. That is why Qatar's job is so strange. It has to connect Washington's demand for free navigation, Iran's demand for security control, and Oman's geographic reality. Battle has moved from missiles and mines into wording. One phrase in a document can decide whether Hormuz is free passage or managed passage. If Qatar sounds too close to Washington, Tehran can reject the deal as American pressure wearing Gulf clothing. If Qatar sounds too close to Tehran, Washington can reject the deal as Iranian control wearing diplomatic clothing. And if Oman is ignored, the deal may look good in a press release and fail the moment commercial ships actually try to use the route. So Qatar is not trying to solve one problem. It is trying to turn three incompatible documents into one agreement. The American document says free navigation must survive. The Iranian document says security management must be recognized. The Gulf document says the war must end without creating a precedent that every small state will regret later. Underneath all of that are three layers of control: physical risk in the water, bureaucratic control over the route, and diplomatic legitimacy over who gets to decide. That is why this negotiation is more dangerous than it looks. The final deal does not just end a crisis, it teaches the world what kind of crisis worked. And right now, the document that matters most is still unsigned. Now move from the negotiation table to the bridge of a commercial tanker, because this is where abstract diplomacy becomes real. The captain does not care about elegant wording. He cares about whether the radio code is valid, whether the route is safe, and whether his ship is insured if something goes wrong. Inside shipping offices, the same question becomes a spreadsheet. Wait outside Hormuz, or submit documents and accept a system nobody wants to normalize. Waiting costs money. Moving through a managed corridor costs legitimacy. And every hour of uncertainty gets priced into insurance. That is how a diplomatic dispute becomes a queue of tankers sitting outside a narrow waterway. One ship waits for clearance, another waits for a sponsor, another waits because its owner does not want to be the first company accused of legitimizing Iran's new rules. Insurance companies see the same picture and do what insurance companies always do. They raise the price of risk. That price does not stay inside a shipping office. It moves into fuel, it moves into groceries, trucking, fertilizer, plastics, heating, air travel, and anything that depends on energy moving normally. A tanker captain waits outside Hormuz, and weeks later a driver on the other side of the world pays more at the pump. That is the mechanism. No missile has to be fired. No warship has to sink. The route simply becomes uncertain, and the market charges everyone for the uncertainty. In this version of sea power, a permit can be as consequential as a destroyer. A clearance code can move markets. A delayed tanker can raise prices. A badly written exception can become tomorrow's rule. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is not only a military problem anymore. It is a paperwork problem, a pricing problem, and a precedent problem. And at the center of that problem, the tanker is still waiting. The Gulf states understand the danger immediately, because if Iran can normalize managed passage in Hormuz, every smaller state in the region has to ask what happens next time. For Qatar, this is not just mediation, it is state strategy, because the precedent does not stop at Hormuz. Suez, Bab el-Mandeb, Malacca, the Taiwan Strait, every choke point on Earth has governments watching this experiment. If one state learns that it can turn a passage into a checkpoint and survive the crisis, other states will study the method. That is why Qatar has to convince the Gulf that any agreement restores free passage instead of quietly accepting Iran's managed corridor. The choice is not simply war or peace. It is free passage or conditional passage, and that choice will probably be hidden inside language that sounds boring enough for most people to ignore. This is where the story stops being America versus Iran and becomes something stranger. Qatar may become the country that decides whether the strait returns to the old system or enters a new one. If Qatar forces a deal that removes the checkpoint logic, it helps preserve the old rule of the sea. If Qatar accepts a deal that keeps permits, sponsors, route controls, or payments alive, then Iran may lose the war and still win the rulebook. So here is the question. Is Qatar about to save free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, or is Qatar about to help normalize the first permanent checkpoint on the world's most important oil corridor? Write your answer in the comments, because the people who say Qatar saves the strait, and the people who say Qatar writes Iran's victory into the deal, are about to have a very serious argument under this video.